Morning students, welcome to your science class. Students, today we are going to move further with our discussion. So we were learning about block 27, which is disease and good health. In yesterday's class we discussed about incommunicable diseases. So what does incommunicable diseases mean, and what were the highlights of our yesterday's class? So first of all, we discussed about non-communicable disease which do not spread through common means are called as the non-communicable disease. So we discussed about disease caused by deficiency of anything. It could be vitamins, it can be proteins, it can be minerals. Then we discussed about the metabolic diseases. What were the metabolic diseases? And which metabolic diseases we discussed about? The diseases caused by malfunctioning of certain organ in the body. And at last we discussed about the hereditary diseases. Hereditary diseases means which gets carried from one generation to another generation to another generation. For example, diabetics. We discussed about an example where I was talking about the great grandfather being diabetic, then the grandfather being diabetic, and then the father being diabetic. So there are high chances rather that the son or the daughter from the father would be the carrier of this disease, and that is called as hereditary. So let's start our today's class and let's see what all we have here. So the first thing is we will be needing some resources, and the resources are usual and very common, which is our S2 worksheet, notebook, Exceed content book. The keywords for our class would be communicable. Communicable means which can be transmitted very easily from one body to another body. Second is the pathogen, the ringworm, and the epidemic. These are biological terms, and this is where we will be discussing about what does these things mean to us. So what is the aim of our class? The aim of our class is that we will be able to explain the ways in which communicable disease are transmitted. So what are communicable disease and how does it get transmitted is what we are going to learn in today's class. Now in these days you have seen very common trend across the world where people wearing mask, right? And why do we cover our nose and mouth when we sneeze? Why do we put mask when we are talking? What is the reason behind it? So students, generally when we talk about this, we cover our nose and mouth when we sneeze. And why do we do that? We do that so that germs do not spread in the air and infect others. Now, what are the communicable diseases if that's the case? So, a communicable disease are the disease which gets transmitted very easily from one person to another person. That is called as the communicable disease. Now, what you have to do is in your extra notebook, you will have to create 3 columns. One is disease, cause, and symptoms. And you can think of any 2 communicable disease and you can just fill the details what you have about this communicable disease. All right, I hope all of you would have done it. So let's see what you have written in your notebook till now. Now the first question is, which diseases are communicable? So when we talk about this, disease such as common cold, which is normal cough and cold you get, then ringworm, especially during summer season you find due to sweat and because of unhygienic unhygienic lifestyles, people suffer from ringworm. Then there is flu. Flu is a kind of a fever which gets transmitted from one person to another person. So these are the things which are called as the communicable disease. Now, how are these disease caused? Now, these disease generally caused by the microorganisms. And what are these microorganisms called as? They are called as pathogens, right? So these pathogens, for example, if we talk about common cold, right? Now, common cold is caused by the virus, right? And when I talk about filariasis is caused by a parasite ringworm, right? And for parasite, and ringworm is caused by the fungus. So generally what happens is, when we talk about pathogens, these pathogens remains in the body, and then when we cough or sneeze, or when the other person comes in contact with the infected person, the other person also gets infected, and that is the reason these pathogens are considered a little dangerous. Now, the last part of the question is, what are their symptoms? What are the symptoms we look at? Now, when we talk about symptoms, like for example, if it's a common cold, we'll suffer from runny nose, sneezing and headache. In skin infection like ringworm, you will get a burning sensation, itchiness. So what happens generally is a small circular patches of infections develop, right? So that can be either on the underarm, or on the feet, or on the scalp, right? Any part of the body you can find these worms getting there. So these are the examples and details about the communicable disease. Now, what are the ways in which this communicable disease can spread? Right? What are the ways? Now, when we talk about ways, communicable disease can spread through contaminated air, right? It can spread through water and food. So, if the water, food, and air is contaminated, then there are high chances that you will suffer from communicable disease. Now, how are communicable disease different from the non-communicable disease? Before that, let's take an example. So generally, it is always asked to cover your face and mouth when coughing or sneezing, is because when you cough or sneeze and when you don't cover it, those pathogens gets transmitted or mixed with air, and then it contaminates to the person whom it gets in touch with. So that is the reason the infected person, when he or she sneezes, he or she should ensure that they use a handkerchief, or they should have at least a mask on their face, so that the transmission can be stopped. So the current example is the virus. The coronavirus is also an example of an communicable disease. Now, how are these two different from each other? Now, when we talk about how they are different, so we can we can say that the communicable disease can be transmitted from contaminated food and water, which we get infected. Now, they can also be transmitted through animal bites, right? So they are transmitted by touching the infected surfaces. That is the reason we normally ask, generally people use sanitizer, so that they come in contact with objects which are publicly used, for example ATM, for example banks, right? Public offices. So all those door handles, the place, the pen, normally used for the visitors, all those are chances that might get infected. So when you sanitize your hand, those germs gets killed off, and that is the reason you remain healthy and safe, right? Now, for example, if we use a handkerchief of an infected person, we are likely to get in touch with the infection, right? Or if we touch an infected body part of a person, like the skin, right, or nose, then you may also catch infection. That is only the reason that people normally ask not to pick your nose, not to put hand in your eyes to clean it, and to avoid keeping your hand or mouth or pen in your mouth, so that the infection which is there cannot get inside the body. So if you are into a habit of biting your nails, or if you are into a habit of picking up your nose, you should stop that immediately, because that's not something good in public health. Now, what about communicable disease? Now, communicable disease and non-communicable disease cannot be, unlike communicable disease, for example, non-communicable disease cannot be transmitted from infected person to a healthy person. So that can be through any means. Like yesterday, I was discussing about a person suffering from diabetes. If that person is having his food, and if the other healthy person, if he shares the food with the healthy person, there is no chance that the other person may get infected because of this, because that is related to something related to the organ of the body, So it will not get transmitted. So these are the basic differences between the communicable disease and the non-communicable disease. Now, high order thinking questions: what happens when a particular disease spreads to a large number of people? Like what we are seeing right now, the coronavirus is spreading across the world. So there is no part of the world which has remained untouched because of this. So what do we call this kind of virus as? So students, this kind of virus are called as an epidemic. So an epidemic spreads rapidly and infects a large amount of population. So a mass of people get infected because of that. Now this type of infection, there is another feature for it, spreads in a very short period of time, right? So do you know any such disease? If yes, give example. So this could be one of the most easiest question at this current time period. Have you come across any such disease? Have you come across any such epidemic which has spread in a very short span of time and very rapidly affecting a huge mass of people? If that, you can give an example. So the answer is yes, it is a coronavirus. Now let me ask you, if I don't talk about coronavirus and if I talk about some other infection, what would it be? So students, it would be earlier to this pandemic, there was swine flu. That was an epidemic in this somewhere around in 2009 time. In the year of 2009, this flu was very common and it created an epidemic, but not compared to the one which we are facing now. So it is a viral disease because it spreads to rapidly and to a large amount of population and gets easily transmitted by air. So this is are the features of the swine flu. Now the question of the day: which of this is not an example of a non-communicable disease? So one among them is what you have to select, which is not a non-communicable disease. So homework, you will have to finish S2, complete practice question and additional question 4, 5 and 6. Complete these three things for homework. And just in case if you have any doubts or any questions related to today's class, you can reach me through the comment section. So thank you for your time and have a wonderful day ahead.